All right. Sorry for the delay getting started. For those of you who are remote, couldn't get set up immediately. There was a little bit of delay as students were arguing with the professor in the past class about exam questions. So I'm set up. We're good to go. We're going to get started. Announcements. I worked on and posted a study guide this morning for an exam that'll take place a week from today. So feel free to take a look at that. You can send me questions if anything is unclear over the weekend, and I can get to you when I can. Otherwise, we will. I want to dedicate a full class period, I think, to a review session for this, because there was a bit more content than I thought there was going to be as I threw together that study guide. It ended up being pretty much 3 full pages. So it's quite a bit there, which means that I want to take the time to make sure that those concepts are cemented and clear and there aren't any confusions. So next Thursday, we will have a full review period. If those questions run dry and people just have nothing to ask, or they feel very confident, then we can transition back to material. But I will at least set aside that day and not expect that we're covering more content.
What day was that?
Week from today for the exam,
Oh,
and
yeah.
then the study period would be Thursday.
Thursday,
So
okay.
yeah, day before. But we don't have class on Monday, so we just have Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday next week. Tuesday and Wednesday will be new content. Thursday will be the review period. Friday will be the exam.
Is the new content from Tuesday and Wednesday gonna be on the exam?
No, only anything in the study guide, which stopped at the anchors. Everything that's currently up right now in terms of slides. So through what is numbered as slide deck 12, we're currently going through 13. So not even this material we're going through right now will be on the exam.
So since there's, looking at it right now, there's about double the amount of, stuff on there, it seems. Does that mean we can have more than one page of notes?
I still am gonna put a page of notes, but I think that as I design the exam, I will design it so that I don't even know how I want to state it, but I very much try to keep fairness in mind when I do that. So I won't query you about very fine details in that. It'll either be very idea-based or critical thinking and design focused.
Should we expect about the same amount as writing as last exam, or less or more?
Don't know.
Okay.
I haven't written it yet. I will go back through when I go back through the study guide. I think what's either really important here, I try to weight the questions from the different topics so that what I think is most important has the most weight on the exam, and the kinds of questions that I designed, but I honestly have no idea what that's going to look like yet in terms of number of questions, how much writing those questions are going to be. In general, I would expect that there's going to be a lot of writing on exams, 4 exams in this class. So I would still expect it to be a lot of writing, but I can't really comparatively assess compared to the past exam until I've written. What I have done for a couple of people in the past is, if you have any health-related concerns about writing that much, let me know, and I can do something like set you up in the front. I hand you a paper exam, and you can type out your responses to that. If that's something that would ensure that you don't have to suffer long-term consequences from that, that is something that I can arrange for. 1, 2.
Why don't we just do this in the lab with the lockdown browser? I feel like, wouldn't that just be easier for all of us and for you?
Possibly. The concern that I have there is it is possible for that even with a lockdown browser. It's easier for the exam questions to leak or exams to get out. So I do prefer to do things on paper, because then it leads to a very easy distribution, and it leads to ensuring that I can keep those paper copies in my office for reference. It's not quite as easy to collect data on this and use that. The reason I collect data on exams is to go through the curriculum and say what was clear, what wasn't, question by question analysis. How did people do? I use that to cycle back into my curriculum and improve it. And that's especially important the first time I'm teaching something like this. I've taught a similar course before, but not over the 2-quarter system. So I'm collecting lots of data this quarter just to see what improvements I can make for the next time that I operate. I do know writing is a pain. Computer scientists especially hate doing it because it's not something that you get a lot of practice with. So your hands get sore before, wrists get sore before most other majors would, because you just don't practice it as much. But
Not gonna be 5 pages of short answer questions.
I don't know yet.
For Hunter's sake, I hope not. That's the main health concern I have is.
Once he graduates, any permanent damage I've done, no, whatever. I'm not kidding. I do care about
Back to work, Hunter.
it. Exactly. Other questions or concerns before we dive back into economic analysis and how that relates to game design?
Have you finished writing the exam?
I finished the study guide this morning during my data structure exam.
Posted, I haven't.
Yeah, I posted it right after I got back to my office, so it should be up. You should be able to take a look at it, formulate some questions, send me some questions over the weekend, and or ask me at the start of next week, whatever works best.
Yeah,
It's always worth checking, because sometimes I think it's up, but it's not revealed or public. I'm getting better at that. Each learning management system has different defaults, and I've used 3 different learning management systems, and they all work differently. It's kind of a pain.
I can confirm it, sorry.
Good. All right, so last we talked, we were in the middle of discussing marginal supply and demand. So this concept of what happens when you change the quantity of something that you have, how does that affect your demand for more of that good or resource? And the example that I used in class was not the one that's immediately here. Numbers were a little bit different, but I said, who's willing to work for me for $20 per hour and grade? Who's willing to work for me for, and then I said, you get $1 billion right now, who's still willing to do that? And there were a couple people who were still willing to do that. But for the most part, everyone was like, nah, if I have $1 billion, I really don't want to be working, let alone grading for
Money's
a
gonna
very
run out
small
somewhere.
proportion. Well, you invest it, and then you can live off the income. You can live off the interest income from that.
Well, yeah, but also then I have a 9 to 5 consistent. Yeah, and.
If that's valuable to you.
It is, because it's even if you invest it. Stock market's just a gamble, so.
Well, it doesn't have to be in the stock market. You can go with bonds, you can go with even high yield savings accounts would give you at least 3% on that. And over a year, 3% of $1 billion is what?
Even if you just,
1% is $10 million.
even if you just split up that $1 billion over 100 years, which is
Yeah.
far longer than you expect to live, that's still 10 million a year, which is more than enough to live off of.
Very comfortably.
Minimum
Here's the
like.
problem, you all just got $1 billion. Something's wrong with the market. So I need a job.
What I didn't tell you is that I gave everyone $1 billion, and now we just have rampant inflation.
This is now worth about a quarter of what it used to be.
It's gonna be like Zimbabwe, we don't need a billion, still barrel.
Yeah, yeah.
Think about it, at least.
Yeah, post-depression Germany, where, yeah. So to relate this back to games, where something you have more of, you're willing to pay more of it. A quest requires you to collect 20 of something, but there's a local store that allows you to purchase that item. You need 20 of it to redeem the quest. Think about, you have 1 of them in your inventory, and this cost is a reasonable portion of the amount of money that you have. Are you willing to spend all of the currency that you have to purchase as many of these as you need to turn in the quest? Yeah, depends, but compare that to something like, you only need 1 more. You have 19 of the 20, and now it's not all of your money, but it's 5% of your money. Rather than going out and farming for that last one, you just want to spend 5% of your currency, buy it, complete the quest, you're done with it. You can move on to the next thing. You're much more likely to be willing to spend a smaller amount of money to purchase that last one than you would be to even purchase 1 when you only had 1 of it and it didn't immediately complete the quest. So that changes the player's marginal demand for that item depending on the in-game state. So this is called margin pressure, and it's actually very frequently used in free-to-play monetized games to make it easy to get really close to a particular goal. But then it's really hard to get exactly to the goal once you are close. And that is when they introduce the ability for you to pay for something to get there. So if you see something like that in any free-to-play game, now you can recognize it as psychological manipulation rather than sometimes you design for psychological manipulation, and that psychological manipulation is what maximizes the money you get as a developer from the game. I don't say that that is a good thing or a bad thing or an ethical thing. I'm not making any of those statements, but it is done and it is effective. You can also look at idle games, very similar to the one that we have. I suppose I should probably talk about that too. I did open something on Canvas for you to submit any of the extra credit idle spreadsheet work that we've been doing over the last week. So that is up. If you'd like to submit that by tonight, that would be awesome. So idle games do this a lot as well. How much does it cost to purchase an additional unit of a resource? And you can balance your idle game such that you can't be as successful as you can be by just focusing on a single resource. You need to spread out your focus to a bunch of different resources and have those costs slowly rise. And only by looking at all of the resources can you optimize the associated gameplay. It's worth noting that you have, as a designer, you have control of the marginal supply and demand. You can think about what changes about the mechanics of the game based on the player's state within that concept that has marginal supply and demand. So you can recognize that your players are going to act differently when they have more of something versus less of something, and you can design around that to give players who don't have much of something an avenue to acquire more that makes sense. For those who have more of something, think about what strategies they're going to be using, and then you can design mechanics around those kinds of strategies. And it makes sure that players across the different, what would I want to call this, progression of a particular element have something to do or some way to apply themselves to that. Another example, if you have all but one of a set of properties in Monopoly, you suddenly very much want to acquire that last property. And if someone else owns it, then your willingness to pay for that property goes way beyond the independent value of that property. But that's something that the player who owns it knows as well. So it's worth so much more to you than it is to them, but they're not going to sell it to you for what it is worth to them because they know how much more valuable it is to you. So it drives the value of that way up for everyone involved, not just you, because now there is a monetary value in keeping you from having it. So if they are going to trade it to you, you need to provide significant value to them. So if you acquire a property that prevents someone else from achieving a monopoly, then that is wonderful for you because you have significant future value, future trade value with that player. And if you really think about the design of these mechanics, then you can increase the number of interesting decisions that your players are making. So it's not just trying to selfishly acquire as many monopolies as possible. You want to think about what kinds of monopolies will I have the ability to trade other players for? It's about maximizing your current and future value rather than just thinking about your current value. So that adds to the strategic layer of the game and is one of the main reasons that this game would be played. As much as most people hate Monopoly, if you couldn't trade with other players, it would lose almost all of the fun that is baked into the game. Questions so far? Yeah.
How does a player market like an Escape from Tarkov or Warframe kind of relate into this, where players can just sell what they have to other players?
We're actually going to talk about that later in the slide deck, because that's a very important concept that drives your own design when you don't have full creative control over what the market price is going to be. So how do you design knowing that players are going to optimize for themselves to try to approximate what those values are going to be so that you can balance around that. If you get a sense that this particular resource is going to be significantly more valuable than this resource, you can change the associated drop rates of them or farmability of them to change what you think the market price is going to be for that item. And that becomes another aspect of design that you can take advantage of. When there are multiple types of trade goods, there's not just one single type of trade good. It starts to get even more interesting. There are more variables at play. So you can see that demand curves are no longer independent from each other. The demand for a particular good is not independent from the demand curve for another good. If the demand curve for one goes up, that means that there's going to be some change here in the other, because you can exchange one good for another good, or there is some ability to trade them or exchange them. So you see kind of a rubber banding effect where the demand for one goes up. Since this good can be exchanged for the other good, the demand for that also goes up and has a new market price as well. There's a concept called imperfect substitutes. That means that there are two different item types, but they almost map one-to-one. There's very little difference between their uses. So you can imagine in an RPG, a potion heals 50 HP and a high potion heals 100 HP. How many potions would you want to trade for one high potion? Depends on if you can use multiple items in one turn, if it's turn-based, or if you can chain them together. If you can do that, then 2 potions is equivalent to a high potion, because you can maybe when you use them outside of combat, they still both recover 100 HP. Maybe they're not perfectly useful for this because it takes 2 turns in battle to use 2 potions that heal 100 HP. But now there is at least some way to relate these items to each other because they do something that is very similar. So you can also think of this in terms of potions versus health potions versus mana potions. If you can use the mana potion to cast a healing spell that restores HP, then there is some conversion between a mana potion and a health potion in terms of they can do the same thing. So let's say suddenly that health potions become significantly more valuable in a game economy because the difficulty was ramped up and now more people need to be able to heal. The price of potions you would expect to go up because the demand has gone up. But because we have an imperfect substitute here, the price for mana potions would also go up because you can convert mana potions into health as another way of achieving that same outcome. So the market prices for these are linked in some way because they're an imperfect substitute. So if one's cheaper than the other, players will prefer the cheaper option. And that leads to increased demand for the cheaper option, which brings them in line with each other. So you get a natural market correction for the associated price of each of these in-game goods. And you can see if you monitor and collect data on your player base, the more people do this, the more effective the substitution is. You don't even necessarily have to collect your own data about how closely related are these items. Your player data will tell you that. Just to see, all right, if I can plot the market price for these items, how are they changing over time? You can use that concept to figure out how related they are. So if you increase the cost of one item, it may increase the demand for the other. Let's say now at a store, potions cost 20% more than mana potions for what would heal you for the equivalent amount. You would expect the demand for the potion to go down and the demand for the mana potion to go up. Also the complement or concept of complements. So the demand for every good goes up and down together. I actually just described this. It kind of works for imperfect substitutes, but complements are actually substitutable for each other. So they will go up and down together because you can use them as direct substitutes for each other. So the extent to which that process is a mirror determines how complementary they actually are. So you can imagine that a balance pass happens over your favorite game and a particular set of equipment becomes very overpowered for a particular build. The prices of those gear pieces are going to move with respect to each other. They are complements for each other because you don't get the big benefit unless you have all of those items as part of a gear set. You don't get all of the benefits unless you have You know, the helmet and the body armor and the leggings and the boots and the gloves. So completing the set has a particular cost. And if you acquire just some of that, you haven't, it's kind of an all or nothing, you haven't gotten there yet. So when that happens, we expect that the demand of everything goes up, and or the rarest earpiece becomes the, what I'm looking for, it's the gateway to getting the benefit of the entire set. Questions on anything so far? All right, let's talk about how we calculate a market price, because that's kind of important. So the market price is wherever, yeah, the supply and demand curves intersect. So we can imagine long-term price. I should probably, again, supposed to have, there we go. Let's actually take a look at it. So long-term price stabilizing around 6 or 7 gold. So just being able to see, here we have the supply curve, here we have the demand curve. When we plot them together with each other, we get a sense of what the market price might be, the intersection of that. So anyone want to take a stab at the logic or the intuition behind why the long-term price of this good would be 6 or 7 gold, whatever this value on the y-axis would be?
Intuitively. It means they sort of zero each other out. The amount of people demanding this good versus the amount of people selling it
Yeah,
matches is the demand.
yeah. So the amount in production is only going to be as much as we can sell for that value. So we can see, based on the willingness to buy, we see that if we produce exactly 16 of this good, then the sale price of all of those goods, in order to liquidate all of them, would have to be 6 to 7 gold. And that would give you 100% turnaround. As a seller, you would be able to sell your entire stock. There would be enough demand to sell your entire stock. If the market price were somewhere up here, then yes, you could get 10 gold for everything you sold, but you'd only be able to sell 10 of them instead of 16 of them. So does that lead to more total profit? Not necessarily. Profit's going to be maximized when you're able to produce as much as the demand can handle, and then the demand is there too. So if the price were out here, there'd be significantly more demand at that particular price, but then the seller wouldn't want to produce that much because the extra value of producing between 16 and 20 of that resource is going to have to mean that everything else gets sold at 4 gold instead of 6 gold. And that leads to less overall profit than if we produced exactly this much. So this market price becomes the long-term stability. It tells, once this is marginal, if you're a seller, you don't want to produce more than this because it drives down the price and drives down your profit. And as a buyer, you don't want to purchase more of it than you need. So if that were the case, then the demand would be driven up, which would drive up the price to purchase more than you need. So it becomes an equilibrium point. And so over the long term, you will see that this price stabilizes and doesn't really move from here unless there is some outside reason why either the demand curve or the supply curve or both would be shifting. If those are consistent, then the price will remain consistent. Questions on the concept of a market price before we talk about how market prices work within each different kind of game economy? All right, let's talk about the fixed economy. So remember that the fixed economy is this concept of everything that is generated comes from the game itself. There's no outside production. There's no way for a player to exchange real money for goods that the game produces just to match with your money. Everything has to be produced by some in-game mechanic. Which means that if you're the designer, you are setting the price for everything in the game. There's no way to interact with other players and trade with other players. So you are responsible for creating this economy from scratch. You're going to be coming up with all of those values. And then as the player plays the game, that will determine what the market price is for that. But you're designing everything so you have total control over what that market price ends up being, as long as you have some way of estimating what the player is going to want to do. How do you design for this? You go back to the game's anchor. And you can also adjust the rarity of certain items, and those two ideas allow you to set the prices for things. So if you want players to want to purchase or have a reason to acquire a particular item that you're designing, then you want to put it in an appropriate place in the anchor's curve. And then you want to make it the appropriate rarity. If it's going to be a little bit stronger than that curve, then you might want to make it a little bit rarer. Make the player have to go out of their way to acquire it. If it's going to be less powerful than that, then maybe it's something that should just drop or be hidden in a treasure chest. That can also be a catch-up mechanic for players who didn't farm before, don't have reasonable equipment for this particular area. Now you just open a treasure chest and there it is. In case you were below the curve, here is your catch-up to get closer to the balance of the curve in this area. That would eliminate a lot of frustration. So, of course, players move through the game. As they do so, they need better items to keep up with the difficulty increase. And they need items and currency that the game is producing as they're playing it to be able to interact with the game's economy. As a designer, you want to make things scarce enough to be interesting. So the player has to decide how and when to spend their money, because there's a limited amount of money. There can be an interesting decision associated with how do I spend this money to maximize my value, maximize my power, maximize my chances of beating the upcoming boss, to experience the next element of the story. But setting that rarity really helps to do that. On one extreme, a player gets so much currency, they can buy whatever they want. The game is imbalanced because there's no decision. It's just whatever the store offers, buy whatever you need. And that's not particularly interesting. Why even have currency and a cost? You could just talk to the store owner who just says, I'm just going to leave now, take what you want. It's kind of the equivalent to that. On the other hand, if the game doesn't drop enough currency or the rarity of items is too high, then the player needs to spend too large of an amount of time trying to keep up with the difficulty curve. So that means that they have to fight more of the same enemies to drop enough currency to buy an upgrade. Or if it's so rare that a particular item has a 0.1% drop chance and they get particularly unlucky, maybe they're going through 1,000 fights to be able to drop that item, and that is not ideal. Players don't love doing that. So they become frustrated doing that. Of course, everything here can be modified, especially once you get players to start playing the game in an alpha or beta test. You can get a sense of, ask them a survey question, how do you feel about the gear progression? You can get a sense of that from just players' feedback. That said, you want to do the best that you can to get it right before you have testers playing your game, especially those who weren't part of the design team or related to people in the design team, because you want to get the initial press for your game to have initially positive feedback. And if your testers get frustrated, yes, you can recover from that, but if they're talking to people or posting about it, even if they're signed under an NDA, stuff will leak and it may affect the game's eventual sales. So as a designer, the purpose here is to minimize how much you need to tweak this after the release of the game. You want to have the system locked down before you release your game, because if you make large balance changes to things like currency acquisition after the game is released, you've already lost some of your players due to frustration, and now you have to convince them to play again, and that's difficult and expensive. Thoughts on this? Yeah.
We have the curve and everything for the market price, but is there also like a minimum amount of items required to actually be an economy in the game? If there are only so many things you can buy and you're gonna get them anyway, does that count as an economy right there?
Yeah, that would be part of the supply curve. So if it's really difficult to produce that concept, then that affects your seller's willingness to sell, because it took so much time or it's so rare that there's additional value, the cost to acquire it, either in terms of time or in-game resources, is higher. And players won't choose to farm that if they can't make profit off of it, or they can't turn it and sell it for value.
Yeah, Red Dead Redemption 2 has a bunch of like chocolate that you can buy. But
Yeah.
it has, like 3 guns and then they unlock them for you regardless when you get through the level. So
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, that is interesting. And games make good use of that, giving you options of whether you want to spend currency on it or go far enough to unlock it otherwise, or those can become interesting decisions, especially if the player is aware that that is an option that they have. If you don't make the player aware of that option, then they may get frustrated that they spent their currency on something that got unlocked later anyway. Yeah, great point. Anything else? All right, so this is everything with regards to a fixed economy. So as a designer, you have a ton of control over every element in the fixed economy. But for a player dynamic economy, and this is what we were getting to a little bit earlier when talking about allowing players to trade and how that affects the economy, this is most frequently found in board games for paper games and in MMOs, or games where lots of players are logged into the same server. So in general, you have the same concepts as the fixed game economies with some changes. First one is that players can trade items in in-game currency or sell them in some kind of auction or auction house type environment. So there is trade. That means there is some value to everything that can be traded in the game because it can be exchanged for each other. So as a designer, you don't set that price. Or at least you don't directly set that price. You indirectly set that price by thinking about drop rates, thinking about how rare each particular item is and what can it be used for. If you allow a particular item to be used for some new game mechanic, then you will increase the demand for it because people will want to use it for that. So you do have indirect control, but you cannot set the price precisely where you want it. Of course, it will be based on the player's supply and demand. So something is priced too high, it sits there in the auction house or in a sale window or something that says, I would like to sell this for, if it's above that demanded price, it's just going to rot. No one is ever going to want it for that price because it is above the market price for that item. If a player expects too much in a trade, the trade may not be accepted. You have to agree on the trade in order for the trade to take place. If an item can be purchased from or sold to some kind of non-player character, then that makes a price ceiling or price floor, if that concept makes sense. Basically, if I can purchase a potion for 50 gold from a vendor, then I'm never going to go buy this potion from another player for 52 gold or 60 gold or anything above 50 gold because I can buy it from the vendor. So that creates a price ceiling for that at the value of the vendor. Now, on the other hand, if a player sells it for 48 gold or 45 gold, suddenly your decision to buy it from the store seems silly. You should go buy it from the player, it's cheaper. And of course, you still have control, but it's an indirect control, so you can control the availability. A drop-only item that becomes something that is sold at a vendor, you can use to create that price ceiling or price floor. You can change the associated drop rate of that item. If there are more of that item, then the supply of that item goes up. If the supply of an item goes up, then the price falls. If we go back to that market price, you can see that if we move the supply curve of an item up, so it's dropping more, there's just more supply, kind of the supply curve does that action, then the market price is going to move along the demand curve to the place where the new supply curve is. So that means that the price is higher. You can also change locations of in-game stores. One of the reasons that people might be willing to pay closer to that price ceiling or price floor, or be willing to pay a player more in an auction house than buying it from a store is if the store is too far away. There's a time cost in addition to an in-game currency cost of traveling to the store, purchasing the item, and traveling back. So if you make stores more accessible or make it an online store that you can just order from the pause menu, then that allows you to minimize the effects of that wasted time. And of course, you can also control any item properties. So something like this really overpowered item that has significantly high demand, now it can only be used by a particular character class because it only makes sense that this very strong buff warrior can use this massive two-handed maul. But before we had no class restriction and this small rogue was using this very large two-handed maul, and it didn't really make sense because it was balanced to be a warrior's weapon. So you can restrict items and who can use them or when they can be used or how frequently they can be used. And that allows you to change the associated market price. But again, you don't set that market price directly. The players will still come up with what the new market price is. You're just, as a designer, forcing their hand to make that change. How about, let's see, we're going to continue talking about player dynamic economy. So the market price in this fluctuates based on any changes to supply and demand. It can also change based on who's currently logged in. You may see that at particular times of the day, it is mostly American and European players who are logged in, and they will set an associated economy based on how frequently they play, how many American and European players are playing the game. 12 hours later, you have the Middle East and Asia playing the game. And maybe there are significantly more players playing at those hours. If that is the case, then supply goes up, but demand also goes up. So you may see some associated market changes based on just how many players are logged in at particular times. So you may see a daily wave and change in the supply and demand of items in your game, if it's a live service game. So yeah, changes based on who's currently logged in, how many active players there are. If your game has 20 active players, those 20 players control the entire supply of player-driven items from the game. But it also changes, there are only 20 players who can possibly demand those items. On the other hand, you have 20 million players, that's significantly more supply and significantly more demand. Players will have more options for buying things from each other. The more players you have, the more fluctuations your market has, the more opportunities players have to buy low and sell high. So the fluctuations themselves become something that is profitable to the players if they're aware of those fluctuations. As a designer, you just have to be aware of how big are those fluctuations. Does that give people reason to not play the game and just turn the game into trading? If the game is just buying low and selling high rather than engaging with the mechanics of the game, is that a good thing for the health of your game? No right answer to that, but it might be a game-to-game decision that you have to make. You also have to think about and balance around wealthy players, because wealthy players have the ability to do significant short-term damage or make significant short-term changes to your market. If they invest all of their money in buying as much of an item as they can, then the supply of that item is suddenly gone or close to zero. If the supply of an item is close to zero, the market price goes way up. And then over time, this player slowly introduces everything that they bought back into the market at the new market price. And that means that they profit significantly. If they can double the market price for an item, they can double the money that they have when they already started out wealthy. So just thinking about the overall, how susceptible is your market to manipulation? That usually comes from your wealthiest players. So when should that manipulation be allowed? When is it an issue? You'll have to figure that out for yourself in a game that you make, but it can lead to a very unhealthy environment if a player who is averagely wealthy wants to purchase something and the only way to purchase it is from another player and the cost has doubled because they identified it as something with low supply that they could buy out. And it changes how your players experience the game, and it may not have been what you anticipated as a designer. There's a concept here called the invisible hand. Regardless of the player's actual knowledge of the in-game economy, the economy will shift to be and stabilize to that market price. Players don't have to have any understanding of economics in order for this system to work. So because of this, you can actually publish your economic information. And players can make an informed decision based on this because the market price won't change based on their inherent knowledge of the value of an item. If that's the case, players appreciate knowing how rare something is or what the associated drop rates are going to be so that they can decide to farm what they want to farm to maximize profit or something like that. If you hide that information from them, the market will still have those associated prices and they'll have to dig into the economics of the game to get a sense of, is this in demand because it's used? Is it in demand because it's rare? You have to figure that out. So the market stabilization just becomes a way of hiding this information. So you could publish it to make it more accessible. Players feel like the developers have their back if that's the case.
In Warframe, you can see the drop rate of all the items, and I feel like that definitely influences the player economy for how they sell certain items.
Yeah, you are able to make an informed decision about what you go do, but the market price would be the same regardless of that published data. So the question is now just, are you looking at drop rates? Or are you looking at market prices to make that determination? So a free-to-play economy is very different from either of these two economies because the entire goal from a designer's perspective is to get people to spend money after you've convinced them to try out the game. So everything that you design for at this point is to keep players long enough to figure out, one, are they going to spend money? If they aren't going to spend money, screw them, you don't care about them anymore. And if they are going to spend money, then you will design around their experience. So designers set the actual real money costs of everything in the game, as well as any frequency of advertisements. For those you want, if you want someone to be able to play the game without spending money, then you need to get advertising revenue. If you do that, you need to balance and figure out what is the frequency of the advertisements. So do some kind of market analysis to figure out how should those costs and frequencies be set to maximize the total amount of income that you bring in from your game. So how do you do that? How do you figure out how to maximize the income from your game? So you need to look at one, market data and competitive analysis. This allows you to look at what have similar games done. So if you are in the same market as some other free-to-play game, you can look at their costs and use that as a baseline because that game is profitable for a reason. So if you just borrow that and use that as a starting point for your own analysis, then you can figure that out for yourself, at least using that as a starting point. You can also alpha and beta test the market. So during your testing, you have associated costs and you get feedback from early players of your game about, are things too expensive? You can also gather all of that data and figure out 70% of the players who played the game paid at least $10. And what does $10 get you? Can I raise that to $12 or raise that to $15? Maybe 60 or 65% of the players pay that now, but the multiplicative value of the profit that you get from that is now higher. Fewer players are paying it, but each one is paying you more, you make more money. You can also target a specific market. So thinking about who are your players? If you're targeting someone who has lots of spare time, are you targeting someone who is busy working every day all the time, has kids, only has a little bit of time to check in with the game, but when they check in with the game, they want to have made significant progress. How do you monetize that idea? So thinking about just your target audience.
35-year-old divorced electrician playing the game.
Yes. You can also keep your prices flexible. So that means that you can either offer very small microtransaction style of costs, very large purchases that give you more. You could keep them flexible in that you offer sales every once in a while, or even what clothing stores do usually is everything is always on sale. I swear, go into any clothing store and I dare you to find a single item that's not on sale. If it's a large scale, it's always on sale to make it look like, wow, this is such a good deal. When did you last see something at the original market price? I honestly haven't really ever seen that in a store like a JCPenney or not that we really have those much anymore, but to get people to buy those items, you can make it look like it's a significant deal. So you set your prices really high and you keep your prices flexible in the extent to which you offer sales. So the base price for something is $100 for this transaction, but then you call it 80% off and it's $20. But then the next sale it can be 75% off. And you can play around with the actual costs of that. And from the player's perspective, this looks way better than doing something like actually changing the base price of something all the time. If you mark it as X% off, next time Y% off, for some reason, players treat this as different and less ethically. It's exactly the same thing, but it looks less ethically questionable. And of course, you want to understand your player psychology. So if you can try to convince people or design your game around getting people to pay for particular aspects. We talked earlier about this concept of pressuring for that last collectible item, making that a point where you pop up and offer some kind of microtransaction in a free-to-play game. If you can recognize the player is close to this, offer them the ability to pay to complete it. That is a little manipulative. Again, I'm not saying that this is ethically valid, but it is very profitable because human psychology is quite predictable and a lot of people are very susceptible to psychological manipulations. And I do not make any claim about the ethical, how ethical this is, but we do see in free-to-play games, this is very effective.
FOMO.
Yeah, there's definitely FOMO. So we'll come back and talk about how do you data and market test free-to-play games. Question?
For the spreadsheet thing, I noticed that it was set up a canvas, it's just like a text entry box.
Oh, it doesn't allow for file. I will make sure to go make that change.
Okay.
All right, here's all the text I put into this. Enjoy reading that.